Welcome to the Deep Chapter. Picture a land torn by clashing dreams, where one people's triumph becomes another's tragedy. In Chapter 5, we unravel the year of 1948 to 1967, from Israel's birth and the Palestinian Nakba to the Six-Day War's seismic shift. These years shaped borders, identities, and conflicts that still echo today. Join me to uncover the human stories behind the history. Let's dive in.
Palestine on the brink of war. It's November 29, 1947, and the United Nations General Assembly passes Resolution 181, partitioning Palestine into Jewish 56% of the land, 558,000 Jews, 407,000 Arabs, an Arab 43%, 804,000 Arabs, 10,000 Jews states, with Jerusalem internationalized. Palestine, a land of approximately 1.85 million to 65% Arab Muslims and Christians, 33% Jews per Justin McCarthy, explodes into civil war. Jewish communities in Tel Aviv, 200,000 residents, and 100 kibbutzim like Degania brace for conflict. While Arab villages from Jaffa to Galilee rally against the plan, the British set to end their mandate on May 14, 1948, withdraw 100,000 troops, leaving chaos. On May 14th, David Ben-Gurion declares Israel's independence in Tel Aviv's Independence Hall, sparking the 1948 Arab-Israeli War as Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invade. By July 1949, Israel controls 78% of Palestine, signing armistices with Arab states. This war, costing approximately 20,000 lives, 6,000 Jews, 13,000 Arabs, per Benny Morris, births a state and a tragedy, reshaping Palestine forever. The stage was set by Chapter 4's tensions. The 1939 White Paper's immigration curbs enraged Zionists. While the Arab revolt's failure left Palestinians leaderless, the Holocaust, 6 million Jews killed, fueled Zionist urgency, with 50,000 illegal immigrants arriving by 1947 per Haganah records. The UN partition, backed by the US and USSR, was a response to Britain's £40 million governance costs and Zionist militancy. Like the 1946 King David Hotel bombing, 91 dead, Arabs, led by the Arab Higher Committee, rejected partition. Fearing minority status despite their 67% majority per Palestine, the war's outcome, Israel's victory and expanded borders, marks a turning point, but at a profound cost, as we'll explore. Why the 1948 war and Israel's independence? Roots of a seismic clash. Why did this war erupt? The immediate trigger was United Nations Resolution 181, passed November 29, 1947, dividing Palestine despite Arab opposition. Britain's mandate, rooted in the 1917 Balfour Declaration, has failed to balance Jewish statehood with Arab self-rule, per Tom Segev. The Holocaust's moral weights, 6 million dead, 250,000 survivors in European camps, per UNRWA pushed global support for a Jewish state, with U.S. President Truman and Soviet leaders backing partition, per UN records. Zionist leaders like Ben-Gurion, heading the Jewish Agency, saw statehood as survival, per his 1942 Biltmore program. Arabs, expecting independence from 1915 McMahon Hussein promises, saw partition as colonial theft, with the Arab League vowing to fight, per their 1947 Cairo resolution. For Jews, the stakes were existential. Post-Holocaust, 700,000 Jews in Palestine, 33% of the population, had built a proto-state with Haganah's 40,000 fighters and 250,000 acres, per Gershon Shafir. For Arabs, at 1.2 million, partition threatened dispossession. 56% of the land went to Jews despite their minority status. The Arab League, led by Egypt's King Farouk and Jordan's King Abdullah, feared Zionist expansion but lacked unity, per Avi Shlaim. Global powers shaped the conflict. U.S. Jewish lobbying, 3 million voters, and Soviet anti-colonial rhetoric pushed partition, per UN records. The war wasn't just local, it was a collision of post-war geopolitics, colonial collapse, and irreconcilable nationalisms, with Palestine as the battleground. How it unfolded. From civil war to armistice. How did the war unfold? The UN vote on November 29, 1947 sparked immediate violence. Arab irregulars attacked Jewish buses in Jerusalem, killing 7 on November 30th, per Devar. By May 1948, civil war claimed 2,000 lives, with Haganah and Ergon clashing against Arab volunteers from Syria, per Morris. Jewish forces launched Plan Dalet March 1948, securing strategic areas like Haifa, where 70,000 Arabs fled after April's battle, per British reports. The Deir Yassin massacre, April 9, 1948, where Ergun killed 107 Arabs, fueled panic, per Khalidi. By May 14th, Britain withdrew, and Ben Gurion declared independence in Tel Aviv's Independence Hall, citing Jewish history and UN legitimacy. Arab states invaded the next day, May 15, 1948. Egypt's 10,000 troops advanced from Sinai. Jordan's Arab Legion, 4,500, targeted Jerusalem and Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, sent 8,000 combined, per Morris. Israel's Haganah, now the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, numbered 35,000. Bolstered by 10,000 rifles from Czechoslovakia, per Haganah records. Israel captured Jaffa in April 1948. 50,000 Arabs fled from Tiberias and Safed. The Nakba began. With 300,000 Arabs displaced by May, per UNRWA, Arab forces, uncoordinated Jordan, sought Jerusalem, Egypt, Gaza faltered. Israel's Operation Dani, July 1948, took Lida and Rommel, expelling 70 Ling Arabs, per. By October, Israel seized the Negev, defeating Egypt's 5,000 troops. Armistices, mediated by UN's Ralph Bunche, were signed in 1949. Israel-Jordan in April, Israel-Egypt in February, and others by July. Context and perspectives: Western historians like Benny Morris see the war as Israel's survival triumph, with Haganah's discipline overcoming Arab disarray. Arab accounts, like Falastin's 1948 editorials, frame it as colonial aggression, echoing Egypt's 1945 independence push. Modern scholars diverge. Morris argues Arab flight was war-driven, while Elon cites Plan Dalet as ethnic cleansing. Resolution 181, 1947, outlined partition. Israel's Declaration of Independence, 1948, claimed statehood. World War II's 50 million dead and Holocaust's moral urgency shifted global support to Zionism. Arabs, inspired by regional nationalism, lacked cohesion. Jordan's secret talks with Israel, per Avi Shlem, undermined unity. The war's outcome: Israel's 78% control reshaped the Middle East, but the human cost lingers in refugee camps and contested narratives. Cause and effect: what caused this war, and what were its ripples? The immediate cause was Unresolution 181, giving Jews 56% of Palestine despite their 33% population share, rejected by Arabs as unfair, per the Arab Higher Committee's 1947 statement. Britain's withdrawal, 100,000 troops gone by, May 1948, left a power vacuum. Per Segev, the Holocaust, 6 million deaths, drove Zionist urgency, with 700,000 Jews in Palestine ready for statehood, backed by US-Soviet votes. Arab states, humiliated by 1947's defeatism, invaded to assert dominance, per their 1947 Cairo resolution, but lacked coordination. Egypt's 10,000 troops and Jordan's 4,500 operated separately. Zionist militias, with 40,000 Haganah fighters and Czech arms, were prepared, per Morris. Short-term effects were seismic. Israel's victory secured 78% of Palestine, including West Jerusalem, far beyond the UN plan. 400,000 Arabs fled or were expelled by July 1948, per UNWA, starting the Nakba. Armistices created the Green Line, with Jordan holding the West Bank. Egypt, Gaza, Israel absorbed 150,000 Arabs as citizens, but tensions persisted. The war cost 20,000 lives, reshaping demographics. Jews, now 80% of Israel's 870,000 population. Arab states, defeated, faced internal unrest, per Shlaim. Long-term Israel's statehood solidified, with institutions like the Knesset 1949 and 700,000 immigrants by 1951, per Jewish Agency. The Nakba created a Palestinian diaspora, 700,000 refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Gaza, per UNRWA, fueling resistance. Arab League's boycott and border raids set the stage for 1956's Suez Crisis and 1967's war. The war entrenched the conflict's modern form. Israel, as a state. Palestinians as exiles shaping debates over right of return and statehood. Britain's exit marked the end of colonial rule, but the US and USSR's roles grew, per Fromkin. Defining Cold War alignments in the Middle East. Picture a Jewish family in Tel Aviv, cheering as Ben-Gurion declares independence, their Holocaust scars healing with statehood's hope. Now, imagine an Arab family in Jaffa, fleeing with only a house key. Their home lost to war's tide. To dreams, one of a new nation, one of a stolen homeland, collide in Palestine's blood-soaked soil. From 1947 to 1949, the Arab-Israeli War birthed Israel, but broke a people, its echoes still resounding. What happens when 700,000 Palestinians become refugees, their loss named the Nakba? The Nakba. Palestinian displacement, 1948-1949. The term Nakba, meaning catastrophe in Arabic, refers to the mass displacement of Palestinians during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which coincided with the establishment of the State of Israel. Between 1948 and 1949, approximately 700,000 Palestinians, over half of the pre-war Palestinian population, fled or were expelled from their homes, creating one of the most significant refugee crises of the 20th century. The pre-1948 landscape, the roots of the Nakba, lie in the complex socio-political dynamics of British Mandate Palestine, 1920 to 1948. Following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, after World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain administrative control over Palestine. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued by the British government, expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also stipulating that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. This declaration set the stage for competing national aspirations between Jewish and Arab communities. During the Mandate period, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased significantly. Driven by Zionist aspirations, and later, the persecution of Jews in Europe, particularly during the Holocaust. By 1947, the Jewish population in Palestine had grown to approximately 600,000. While the Arab population stood at around 1.2 million, land purchases by Jewish organizations such as the Jewish National Fund and the establishment of Jewish settlements heightened tensions as Palestinian Arabs feared marginalization and loss of control over their ancestral lands. The United Nations Partition Plan. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 181, proposing the partition of Palestine into independent Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international administration. The plan allocated 56% of the territory to the Jewish state. Despoti Jews constituting about 1/3 of the population and owning roughly 7% of the land. The Arab state was to receive 43%, with the remaining area designated for Jerusalem. The Jewish leadership, represented by the Jewish Agency, accepted the plan, viewing it as a step toward statehood. In contrast, Palestinian Arab leaders and the Arab Higher Committee rejected it, arguing that it violated their right to self-determination and disproportionately favored the Jewish minority. The rejection of the partition plan, coupled with escalating violence between Jewish and Arab communities, set the stage for the 1948 war and the subsequent displacement of Palestinians. Causes of the Nakba. The Nakba was the result of multiple intersecting factors, including military conflict, political decisions, and social upheaval. The following sections outline the primary causes of Palestinian displacement during 1948, 1949, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Arab-Israeli War, which began on May 15, 1948. Following Israel's declaration of independence, was a pivotal factor in the Nakba. The war can be divided into two phases. The civil war within Palestine, November 1947, May 1948, and the subsequent interstate conflict involving neighboring Arab states. Civil war phase, November 1947, May 1948. Following the UN partition vote, violence erupted between Jewish and Palestinian Arab communities. Jewish paramilitary groups, such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, clashed with Palestinian militias and irregular forces. Both sides engaged in attacks on civilian populations, including bombings, ambushes, and reprisals. Notable incidents include the Deir Yassin massacre in April 1948, where Ergun and Leahy forces killed over 100 Palestinian villagers, an event that fueled fear and prompted mass flight. During this phase, the Haganah implemented Plan Dalet, a military strategy aimed at securing territory allocated to the Jewish state and defending against anticipated Arab invasions. While historians debate whether Plan Dalet explicitly called for the expulsion of Palestinians, its implementation involved the capture of Arab villages and towns, often leading to the displacement of their inhabitants. By May 1948, approximately 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians had already fled or been expelled. Interstate War Phase, May 1948, January 1949. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The following day, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq invaded, aiming to prevent the consolidation of the Jewish state. However, the Israeli forces, bolstered by superior organization and arms, gained the upper hand. Key operations, such as Operation Hiram in the Galilee and Operation Yov in the Negev, resulted in the capture of additional Arab villages and towns, further displacing Palestinian populations. Psychological warfare and fear of violence played a significant role in Palestinian displacement. Reports of massacres, such as Deir Yassin, were amplified by both Arab and Jewish sources, creating a climate of panic. Jewish forces occasionally used psychological tactics, such as loudspeaker announcements warning of impending attacks, to encourage civilians to flee. Meanwhile, Arab radio broadcasts and rumors of atrocities further exacerbated the sense of insecurity, prompting many Palestinians to leave their homes preemptively. Political and leadership failures. Palestinian Arab leadership faced significant challenges during this period. The Arab Higher Committee, led by Hajj Amin al-Husseini, lacked the organizational capacity to mount an effective resistance or coordinate a unified response to the crisis. Internal divisions, coupled with limited military resources, weakened the Palestinian position. Additionally, the intervention of Arab states, while intended to support the Palestinian cause, was marred by competing agendas and poor coordination, further undermining efforts to prevent displacement. Socioeconomic disruption. The collapse of the Palestinian economy during the war contributed to displacement. Urban centers like Jaffa and Haifa, which had mixed Arab-Jewish populations, saw significant disruption as businesses closed and access to resources dwindled. The breakdown of social and economic structures left many Palestinians with little choice but to flee in search of safety and stability. Key events of the Nakba. The Nakba unfolded through a series of events that resulted in the destruction or depopulation of hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns. Below are some of the most significant episodes. Fall of major cities. Haifa, a major port city with a mixed population, was a focal point of conflict. In April 1948, the Haganah launched Operation Misperium, capturing the city after intense fighting. Many of Haifa's 70,000 Palestinian residents fled, fearing violence or following calls from Arab leaders to evacuate temporarily. By the end of the operation, only a few thousand Palestinians remained in Haifa. Jaffa, another key urban center, fell to Jewish forces in May 1948 after a prolonged siege. The city's 70,000 Palestinian inhabitants were largely displaced, with many fleeing by sea to Gaza or Lebanon. The fall of Jaffa marked a significant loss for the Palestinian community, as it was a cultural and economic hub. Village depopulation. Hundreds of Palestinian villages were depopulated during the war, either through direct military action or voluntary flight. According to historian Benny Morris, approximately 400 to 500 villages were destroyed or abandoned. In some cases, residents were forcibly expelled by Israeli forces. In others, they fled to avoid advancing armies or anticipated violence. Notable examples include Lida and Ramel, July 1948, during Operation Dani. Israeli forces captured the towns of Lida and Ramel, expelling approximately 50,000 to 70,000 residents. The expulsion, ordered by Israeli commanders, was one of the largest single instances of displacement during the Nakba. Deir Yassin, April 1948. The massacre of over 100 villagers by Irgun and Leahy forces became a symbol of the violence that drove Palestinian flight. The event received widespread attention, amplifying fears among Palestinian communities. Role of Arab states. The intervention of Arab states in May 1948 aimed to reverse Israeli gains, but ultimately failed to alter the outcome of the war. The Arab armies were poorly coordinated, and their efforts were hampered by logistical challenges and differing objectives. For example, Jordan's Arab Legion focused on securing the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Egypt prioritized the Gaza Strip. The failure of Arab forces to prevent Israeli advances contributed to the permanent displacement of many Palestinians. Consequences of the Nakba. The Nakba had profound and far-reaching consequences for the Palestinian people, the State of Israel, and the broader Middle East. The following sections explore its immediate and long-term impacts. Immediate consequences. By the end of the 1948 war, approximately 700,000 Palestinians had become refugees. Dispersed across the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, was established in 1949 to provide humanitarian aid and protection to registered Palestinian refugees. Refugee camps, such as those in Lebanon's Shatila and Jordan's Baqa, became enduring symbols of displacement. Loss of land and property. The displacement of Palestinians resulted in the loss of homes, farmland, and businesses. In the aftermath of the war, Israel passed laws such as the absentee property law in 1950, which allowed the state to confiscate properties belonging to Palestinians who had fled or been expelled. This legislation formalized the transfer of Palestinian land to Jewish ownership, significantly altering the demographic and economic landscape of the region. Destruction of Palestinian society. The Nakba dismantled the social and cultural fabric of Palestinian society. Urban elites, rural communities, and extended family networks were fragmented as people were scattered across multiple countries. The loss of major cities like Jaffa and Haifa, which had been centers of Palestinian culture and intellectual life, further eroded communal cohesion. Right of return. The question of the Palestinian right of return remains one of the most contentious issues in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Palestinians and their descendants, now numbering over 5 million registered. Refugees demand the right to return to their pre-1948 homes, citing UN General Assembly Resolution 194, 1948, which calls for the return of refugees willing to live in peace with their neighbors. Israel, however, has consistently rejected large-scale returns, arguing that they would undermine the Jewish character of the state. Statelessness and identity. The Nakba created a stateless population whose identity became tied to the experience of displacement and the struggle for self-determination. Palestinian refugee communities, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan, faced challenges integrating into host societies, often living in marginalized conditions. The Nakba also fostered a collective memory that continues to shape Palestinian national identity. With oral histories, literature, and art preserving narratives of loss and resilience. Regional and global implications. The Nakba had ripple effects across the Middle East, straining relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The refugee crisis placed significant burdens on host countries, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, and fueled anti-Israel sentiment in the Arab world. Internationally, the Nakba drew attention to the plight of Palestinian refugees, shaping debates about humanitarian aid, self-determination, and conflict resolution. Perspectives on the Nakba. The Nakba is a deeply polarizing event, with differing interpretations depending on the perspective. The following sections outline the primary narratives. Palestinian narrative for Palestinians. The Nakba represents a profound trauma marked by loss, dispossession, and exile. Palestinian historians, such as Waled Khalidi and Rashid Khalidi, emphasize the deliberate nature of the expulsions, pointing to events like Deir Yassin and the implementation of Plan Dalit as evidence of a systematic effort to displace Palestinians. The Nakba is central to Palestinian collective memory, symbolizing both the loss of homeland and the ongoing struggle for justice. Israeli narrative. Israeli perspectives on the Nakba vary. Official Israeli narratives, particularly in the early decades of the state, framed the displacement as a consequence of war and Arab rejection of the UN partition plan. Some Israeli historians, like Benny Morris, acknowledge instances of expulsion but argue that the displacement was primarily a byproduct of military necessity rather than a premeditated policy. Revisionist Israeli historians, however, have challenged this view, using declassified documents to highlight instances of deliberate ethnic cleansing. International perspectives. The international community has approached the Nakba primarily through the lens of humanitarian aid and conflict resolution. The establishment of UNRWA and the passage of Resolution 194 reflect efforts to address the refugee crisis. However, the lack of a political resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict has limited progress on addressing the root causes of the Nakba, legacy, and commemoration. The Nakba remains a central element of Palestinian identity and political discourse. Annual commemorations such as Nakba Day on May 15th serve as a reminder of the displacement and a call for the right of return. Palestinian literature, art, and film, such as the works of poet Mahmoud Darwish and filmmaker Ilya Suleiman, continue to explore themes of loss and resilience. For Israel, the Nakba poses complex questions about historical responsibility and reconciliation. Some Israeli organizations, such as Zakrit, advocate for recognition of the Nakba and the inclusion of its history in Israeli education, though such efforts remain controversial. The Nakba was a transformative event that reshaped the demographic, political and cultural landscape of Palestine and the broader Middle East. Driven by the interplay of war, political decisions, and social upheaval, the displacement of approximately 700,000 Palestinians had profound and lasting consequences. The Nakba remains a deeply contested issue, with competing narratives shaping the discourse around the Arab-Israeli conflict. Understanding the causes, events, and impacts of the Nakba is essential for grappling with the ongoing challenges of displacement, statelessness, and the search for a just resolution. Israel's state building and Arab responses, 1949 to 1956. The period from 1949 to 1956 was a pivotal phase in the establishment and consolidation of the State of Israel. Following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, emerging from a costly conflict, Israel faced the immense challenge of building a functioning state amidst internal diversity and external hostility. This subsegment examines Israel's efforts to establish political institutions, develop its economy, integrate a rapidly growing population, and secure its borders. Simultaneously, it explores the responses of Arab states and Palestinian communities, whose actions, ranging from diplomatic isolation to cross-border raids, shaped the early Arab-Israeli conflict. By analyzing these dynamics, this chapter provides a comprehensive understanding of Israel, its formative years, and the regional reactions to its state-building efforts. Israel's state building, 1949 to 1956. After the 1948 war, Israel transitioned from a provisional entity to a sovereign state, navigating challenges such as limited resources, a diverse population, and ongoing tensions with neighboring countries. The armistice agreements of 1949 with Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria established temporary borders known as the Green Line, but did not resolve the underlying conflict. Israel's state-building efforts focused on political consolidation, economic development, social integration, and security, each explored in depth below. Political consolidation, establishment of governmental institutions. Israel's political system was formalized following its declaration of independence on May 14, 1948. By early 1949, the state held its first democratic elections with 85% voter turnout, establishing the Knesset as the unicameral legislature. David Ben-Gurion's Mappé Workers' Party of the Land of Israel secured the largest share of seats, enabling Ben-Gurion to become Israel's first prime minister. The government operated as a coalition, reflecting the diverse political spectrum, which included socialist, religious, and liberal parties such as MAPAM, the United Religious Front, and the Progressive Party. The Knesset passed foundational legislation to solidify Israel's identity and governance. The Law of Return 1950 granted every Jew the right to immigrate and acquire citizenship, embodying the state's Zionist ethos. The Nationality Law 1952 clarified citizenship criteria, including provisions for non-Jewish residents, though implementation often favored Jewish immigrants. The government also established a presidency, with Chaim Weizmann as the first president, serving a largely ceremonial role. Administrative structures were centralized to manage the state's limited resources. The provisional government, in place since 1948, transitioned into a permanent one by 1949, with ministries overseeing defense, education, agriculture, and welfare. Despite coalition tensions, particularly over religious versus secular policies, the government prioritized national unity to address immediate challenges like immigration and security. Legal and administrative framework: Israel's legal system blended elements from the British Mandate, Ottoman law, and Jewish legal traditions. The judiciary was established with a Supreme Court that functioned as both an appellate court and a high court of justice baggats, capable of reviewing government actions. This dual role strengthened checks and balances. Though the legal system faced challenges in addressing the status of Palestinian citizens and confiscated properties, the absentee property law, 1950, was a significant and controversial measure, allowing the state to take control of properties abandoned by Palestinians during the 1948 war. This law facilitated Jewish settlement in former Palestinian towns and villages, but deepened Arab grievances. As it effectively barred refugees from reclaiming their homes, land policies were administered through the Israel Land Authority and the Jewish National Fund, which prioritized Jewish settlement and agricultural development. The Israel Defense Forces (IDF) were formalized as a unified military under civilian control, replacing pre-state paramilitary groups like the Haganah Hergon and Lehi. Conscription was introduced for Jewish citizens, fostering a sense of national duty but excluding most Palestinian Arabs, which contributed to their marginalization. Economic development: Israel's economy in 1949 was fragile, strained by war expenses, infrastructure damage, and the influx of immigrants. The government adopted a mixed economy model, combining socialist principles with pragmatic measures to stimulate growth and absorb newcomers. Mass immigration and economic strain: between 1949 and 1956, Israel absorbed approximately 700,000 Jewish immigrants, nearly doubling its population from 650,000 in 1948 to over 1.3 million by 1956. These immigrants included Holocaust survivors from Europe, Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, Mizrahim, such as Iraq, Yemen, and Morocco, and smaller groups from Asia and North Africa. The law of return facilitated this influx, but the economic and logistical challenges were immense. To house immigrants, the government established Mobaret transit camps, temporary settlements often consisting of tents or shacks. By 1951, over 200,000 immigrants lived in Mobaret, where conditions were harsh, with limited access to sanitation and employment. Social tensions emerged, particularly between Ashkenazi European and Mizrahi Jews, as the latter often faced discrimination and were settled in peripheral areas. The government's absorption policies prioritized rapid integration, but disparities in education and job opportunities persisted. To finance immigration and development, Israel secured external funding. The 1952 Luxembourg Agreement with West Germany provided reparations for Holocaust-related losses, injecting $845 million, equivalent to billions today, into the economy over a decade. Contributions from Jewish diaspora communities, particularly in the United States, and loans from international banks also supported economic efforts. Agricultural and industrial expansion: agriculture was a cornerstone of Israel's economy, driven by the ideological commitment to making the desert bloom. The kibbutz collective farms and moshav cooperative settlement systems expanded, to over 200 kibbutzim and 300 uvim by 1956. These settlements were supported by government investments in irrigation, notably the Yarka Negev pipeline, which facilitated farming in arid regions. Citrus exports, particularly Jaffa oranges, became a significant source of revenue. Industrial development was slower, but gained traction through state-owned enterprises and private initiatives. Key industries included textiles, food processing, and chemicals. The government established the Histadrut, a powerful labor federation, which controlled major enterprises and provided social services, reinforcing the socialist character of the economy. By 1956, industrial output had grown, though unemployment and inflation remain challenges. With unemployment peaking at 10% in 1953, economic challenges and achievements, the economic strain of immigration and defense spending led to austerity measures, including rationing the Tzina policy. From 1949 to 1952, food and clothing were distributed through coupons to manage shortages, but public discontent grew, particularly among new immigrants. Despite these difficulties, Israel's GDP grew at an average annual rate of 9% from 1950 to 1956, driven by foreign aid, agricultural exports, and industrial investment. By 1956, the economy showed signs of stabilization, though disparities between urban and rural areas and between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi communities persisted. Social integration. Israel's diverse population posed significant challenges to social cohesion. The integration of immigrants required addressing linguistic, cultural, and socioeconomic differences. The government prioritized Hebrew as a unifying language, expanding the Elpin system-intensive Hebrew schools. To teach immigrants, by 1956, over 100,000 immigrants had attended Alpinim, fostering linguistic unity, but sometimes marginalizing Arabic and Yiddish speakers. Education was a key tool for nation-building. The 1949 compulsory education law mandated free education for children aged 5 to 14, with curricula emphasizing Jewish history, Hebrew literature, and Zionist values. Military service, mandatory for Jewish men and women, further reinforced national identity, though exemptions for religious students and exclusion of most Arabs created divisions. Palestinian citizens of Israel, the approximately 150,000 Palestinians who remained in Israel after 1948, about 13% of the population, faced significant challenges. Declared citizens under the nationality law, they were subject to military administration until 1966, which restricted their movement, access to jobs, and political participation. Land expropriation, justified under security or development pretexts, reduced Palestinian landholdings, with over 40% of Arab-owned land confiscated by 1956. For example, the village of Ikrit saw its residents displaced in 1948, with promises of return unfulfilled. Palestinian political activity was limited, but some engaged through the Communist Party Maki, which advocated for Arab rights and gained support in Arab communities. Cultural and social life persisted, with Nazareth emerging as a center for Palestinian intellectual activity. However, discriminatory policies such as limited access to public services and employment fostered a sense of alienation, shaping a distinct Palestinian-Israeli identity. Security and defense security was a paramount concern. Given the hostility of neighboring Arab states and the unresolved armistice lines, the IDF was professionalized, with a focus on rapid mobilization and defensive capabilities. By 1956, the IDF had grown to include 150,000 active and reserve personnel, supported by conscription and training programs. Cross-border raids by Palestinian Fedayeen, primarily from Jordan's West Bank and Egypt's Gaza Strip, posed a persistent threat. Between 1949 and 1956, over 400 Israelis were killed in such attacks, targeting farms, kibbutzim, and infrastructure. Israel adopted a policy of reprisal raids to deter further incursions, often targeting Jordanian or Egyptian military outposts. The 1953 Kibbutz raid, in which Israeli forces killed 69 Palestinian civilians in response to a Fedayeen attack, was a notable example, drawing international condemnation and highlighting the cycle of violence. Israel also developed a doctrine of deterrence, emphasizing preemptive strikes and disproportionate responses to signal strength. Arms acquisitions, particularly from France and Britain, bolstered Israel's military capabilities. Though reliance on Western support underscored its geopolitical vulnerabilities, Arab responses to Israel's state-building, establishment and consolidation of Israel elicited strong responses from Arab states and Palestinian communities. Shaped by the 1948 Nakba, regional politics, and emerging pan-Arabist ideologies, these responses ranged from diplomatic efforts to military actions, reflecting both unity and disarray in the Arab world. Palestinian responses The approximately 700,000 Palestinian refugees displaced during the 1948 war were dispersed across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Gaza Strip. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, established in 1949, provided essential services like food, healthcare, and education to over 900,000 registered refugees by 1956. Camps such as Baka, in Jordan, and Shatila in Lebanon became symbols of displacement, with overcrowding and poverty exacerbating refugee hardships. Palestinians demanded the right of return, as articulated in UN General Assembly Resolution 194/1948. But Israel's refusal to allow repatriation deepened their sense of injustice. The absence of a unified Palestinian leadership hindered coordinated action. The Arab Higher Committee, led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, was weakened by internal divisions and exile, leaving refugees reliant on host governments or grassroots initiatives. Fedayeen groups emerged as a form of resistance, conducting cross-border raids into Israel from Jordan and Gaza. These groups, often loosely organized and supported by local communities, viewed their actions as reclaiming their rights. By 1956, Fedayeen attacks had killed over 400 Israelis, prompting harsh Israeli reprisals that further escalated tensions. Palestinians in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, faced systemic marginalization under military administration. Restricted movement and land confiscations limited their economic opportunities. While political representation was minimal, the Communist Party Maki and local leaders such as Tawfik Tubi provided a platform for advocating equal rights, but their influence was limited. Cultural expressions, including poetry and newspapers like Al-Ittihad, preserved Palestinian identity, though government censorship constrained their reach. Arab state responses. Arab states, still reeling from their 1948 defeat, adopted multifaceted strategies to counter Israel's consolidation, including diplomatic isolation, economic boycotts, and military preparations. Diplomatic isolation. The Arab League, comprising Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, led efforts to isolate Israel. In 1950, the League formalized an economic boycott, targeting companies trading with Israel and extending to secondary and tertiary boycotts of firms associated with Israel. This boycott aimed to weaken Israel's economy, but had limited impact due to Israel's growing ties with Western countries. Arab states refused to recognize Israel or negotiate peace. Viewing the 1949 armistice agreements as temporary, they lobbied at the United Nations to keep the Palestinian refugee issue prominent, supporting resolutions like 194 that called for repatriation. However, divisions among Arab states such as Jordan's interest in annexing the West Bank versus Egypt, as focus on regional leadership, undermined a unified approach. Military buildup and border tensions. Arab states began rebuilding their militaries, often with external support. Egypt, under King Farouk and later the Free Officers government, acquired British and Soviet arms, including tanks and aircraft. Jordan's Arab Legion, trained by British officers, was a formidable force in the West Bank. Syria and Lebanon, though less militarily capable, also sought to strengthen their defenses. Cross-border tensions were a constant challenge. Fedayeen raids from Jordan and Gaza, often tolerated by host governments, provoked Israeli reprisals. For example, the 1951 attack on the Jordanian village of Sharafat, in response to a Fedayeen raid, killed several civilians and strained Jordan-Israel relations. These incidents highlighted the fragility of the armistice lines and the lack of a political resolution. Rise of Pan-Arabism. The early 1950s saw the emergence of Pan-Arabism, particularly in Egypt after the 1952 Free Officers coup led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser's vision of Arab unity and resistance to Western influence resonated across the region, framing Israel as a colonial outpost. His rhetoric inspired Palestinian Fedayeen and influenced Arab policies, though practical cooperation among Arab states remained limited due to competing national interests. Regional and global context. The Cold War shaped Arab and Israeli strategies. The United States and Soviet Union competed for influence in the Middle East, with the U.S. providing financial aid to Israel and Jordan and the Soviet Union supporting Egypt and Syria through arms deals such as the 1955 Czech Agreement with Egypt. Israel's alignment with Western powers, particularly France and Britain, secured military and economic support, but reinforced Arab perceptions of Israel as a Western proxy. The Palestinian refugee crisis gained international attention, with UNRWA's operations highlighting the humanitarian dimension. However, political divisions at the UN, particularly between Western and Soviet blocs, prevented progress on resolving the refugee issue or the broader conflict. Consequences and legacy for Israel. Israel's state building from 1949 to 1956 established a resilient state capable of absorbing immigrants, developing its economy, and defending its borders. The consolidation of political institutions, agricultural growth, and military professionalization were significant achievements. However, the marginalization of Palestinian citizens and the unresolved refugee issue created internal tensions and external threats, shaping Israel's security-focused policies. For Palestinians, the Palestinian refugee population remained stateless, with limited prospects for return or integration. Fedayeen resistance marked the beginnings of organized Palestinian militancy, while Palestinian citizens of Israel developed a distinct identity amid systemic discrimination. The Nakba's legacy continued to fuel Palestinian grievances and aspirations for self-determination. For Arab states' failure to reverse Israel's consolidation deepened their resolve to challenge the Jewish state. The boycott and diplomatic isolation had limited success. While military buildup and border tensions escalated the conflict, Pan-Arabism provided ideological unity, but exposed divisions, as states prioritized national interests over collective action. Long-term implications. The period from 1949 to 1956 entrenched the Arab-Israeli conflict as a central feature of Middle Eastern politics. Israel's state-building success contrasted with the ongoing Palestinian displacement and Arab frustrations, setting the stage for future confrontations. The lack of a peace process and the cycle of violence along the armistice lines underscored the need for a political resolution, which remained elusive. The years 1949 to 1956 were a transformative period for Israel, marked by significant strides in state building, despite internal and external challenges. The establishment of political institutions, economic growth, and social integration efforts laid the foundation for a viable state, while security policies addressed persistent threats. Arab responses, from diplomatic isolation to Fedayeen raids and military buildup, reflected the deep-seated opposition to Israel's existence, shaped by the 1948 Nakba and regional dynamics. Understanding these developments provides critical insight into the complexities of the Arab-Israeli conflict during this formative period. The Suez Crisis and regional tensions 1956-1957. The Suez Crisis of 1956-1957 was a pivotal event in the Middle East, marking a significant escalation in the Arab-Israeli conflict and reshaping regional and global power dynamics. Triggered by Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, the crisis involved a tripartite invasion by Israel, Britain, and France, followed by intense international pressure that forced their withdrawal. This subsegment examines the causes of the crisis, the military and diplomatic developments, the roles of key actors, and the broader regional tensions that both fueled and resulted from the conflict. By analyzing these elements, this chapter provides a nuanced understanding of the Suez Crisis and its lasting impact on Israel, the Arab world, and international relations. Historical context. The Suez Crisis emerged from a confluence of regional and global factors, including the legacy of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the rise of Arab nationalism, and the Cold War's influence on the Middle East. The following sections outline the key precursors to the crisis. Post-1948 regional dynamics, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and the subsequent Nakba left deep scars in the Middle East. Israel's consolidation as a state, coupled with the displacement of approximately 700,000 Palestinian refugees, fueled Arab hostility. The 1949 armistice agreements with Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria established temporary borders, but did not resolve the underlying conflict. Cross-border raids by Palestinian Fedayeen, particularly from Egypt's Gaza Strip and Jordan's West Bank, and Israel's reprisal operations, such as the 1953 Kibbutz raid, created a cycle of violence that heightened tensions. Rise of Arab nationalism, the early 1950s, saw the emergence of Pan-Arabism, led by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser. Following the 1952 Free Officers' coup, Nasser became a charismatic advocate for Arab unity and resistance to Western imperialism and Zionism. His rhetoric resonated across the Arab world, positioning Egypt as a leader in the anti-Israel cause. Nasser's policies, including support for Palestinian Fedayeen and efforts to modernize Egypt's military, challenged Israel's security and Western interests in the region. The Suez Canal and Western interests. The Suez Canal, completed in 1869 and managed by the British-controlled Suez Canal Company, was a vital artery for global trade, particularly for oil shipments from the Persian Gulf to Europe. Britain and France, as major shareholders, viewed the canal as critical to their economic and strategic interests. Egypt's dependence on canal revenues, however, created friction with Western powers, especially as Nasser sought to assert Egyptian sovereignty. Cold War influences. The Cold War shaped the Suez Crisis, with the United States and Soviet Union competing for influence in the Middle East. The 1955 Check Arms Deal, through which Egypt acquired Soviet weaponry, alarmed Israel and its Western allies. The US and Britain, seeking to counter Soviet influence, initially supported Egypt through projects like the Aswan High Dam, but withdrew funding in 1956, citing Nasser's alignment with the Soviet bloc. This withdrawal set the stage for Egypt's nationalization of the canal. Causes of the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis was driven by a combination of Egyptian actions, Israeli security concerns, and Anglo-French imperial ambitions. The following sections detail the primary causes. Nationalization of the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956. Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, citing the need to fund the Aswan High Dam after Western withdrawal of support. The move was a bold assertion of Egyptian sovereignty, challenging British and French economic interests. Nasser promised compensation to shareholders and ensured the canal remained open to international shipping. But Britain and France viewed the nationalization as a threat to their influence and access to Middle Eastern oil. Israeli security concerns. Israel faced persistent security threats from Palestinian Fedayeen raids, particularly from the Gaza Strip, which Egypt controlled. Between 1951 and 1956, over 400 Israelis were killed in such attacks, targeting civilians and infrastructure. Israel's reprisal raids, often targeting Egyptian military outposts, escalated tensions. Additionally, Egypt's blockade of the Strait of Tiran since 1948 restricted Israel's access to the Red Sea, hampering trade through the port of Eilat. The Check Arms Deal further heightened Israel's fears of Egyptian military superiority, prompting calls for preemptive action. Anglo-French imperial ambitions. Britain and France sought to regain control over the Suez Canal and curb Nasser's influence, which they perceived as a challenge to their colonial interests. Britain, still reeling from the loss of imperial dominance, viewed Nasser's actions as a threat to its Middle Eastern influence. France, embroiled in the Algerian War, accused Nasser of supporting Algerian rebels, further motivating its desire to weaken him. Both powers saw military intervention as a means to reassert their authority and secure the canal. The Suez Crisis. Key events. The Suez Crisis unfolded through a series of diplomatic and military developments, culminating in the tripartite invasion and subsequent international intervention. The protocol in response to the canal's nationalization. Britain, France, and Israel secretly negotiated a plan to invade Egypt. The Sèvres Protocol, signed in October 1956 in France, outlined a coordinated strategy. Israel would invade the Sinai Peninsula, providing a pretext for Britain and France to intervene as peacekeepers to secure the canal. The agreement was kept secret to avoid international backlash, with Israel aiming to neutralize Fedayeen bases and open the Strait of Tiran, while Britain and France sought to regain control of the canal and topple Nasser. Operation Kadesh. Israel's invasion on October 29, 1956. Israel launched Operation Kadesh, a rapid military offensive into the Sinai Peninsula. The IDF, under the command of Chief of Staff Moshe Dayan, deployed paratroopers and armored units, capturing key positions such as Raif and El Arish. Within days, Israeli forces had overrun much of Sinai and the Gaza Strip, dismantling Fedayeen bases and securing the Strait of Tiran. The operation was a military success, with Israel suffering minimal casualties, 172 killed, compared to thousands of Egyptian losses. Anglo-French intervention. On October 30th, 1956, Britain and France issued an ultimatum demanding that both Israel and Egypt withdraw from the Canal Zone and allow Anglo-French forces to occupy key points to protect the waterway. Egypt rejected the ultimatum, as the canal was well outside the conflict zone. On October 31st, British and French air forces began bombing Egyptian airfields, followed by a ground invasion on November 5th, targeting Port Said and Port Fouad. The operation, codenamed Operation Musketeer, aimed to seize the canal and destabilize Nasser's regime. An international response? The tripartite invasion provoked swift international condemnation. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, opposed the intervention, fearing it would alienate Arab states and bolster Soviet influence in the region. The Soviet Union, preoccupied with the Hungarian Revolution, issued strong warnings but stopped short of direct intervention. At the United Nations, the General Assembly passed Resolution 997 on November 2, 1956, calling for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of foreign forces. The UN established the United Nations Emergency Force, UNEF, the first UN peacekeeping mission to supervise the ceasefire and secure the Canal Zone. Under US and UN pressure, Britain and France agreed to a ceasefire on November 6, 1956, and began withdrawing their forces by December. Israel, initially resistant, completed its withdrawal from Sinai and Gaza by March 1957, though it secured guarantees for freedom of navigation through the Strait of Tiran and the deployment of UNEF in Sinai to prevent Fedayeen raids. Consequences of the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis had profound, immediate, and long-term consequences for Israel. The Arab world and global politics reshaping regional dynamics and highlighting the decline of colonial powers. Immediate consequences. Israel achieved its military objectives, including the temporary elimination of Fedayeen bases in Gaza and the opening of the Strait of Tiran. The IDF's performance demonstrated its capabilities, boosting national morale and reinforcing its deterrence doctrine. However, Israel's withdrawal from Sinai and Gaza under international pressure underscored its reliance on Western support, particularly from the United States. The deployment of UNEF along the Egypt-Israel border provided a temporary buffer, reducing cross-border tensions. Egypt and Nasser. Despite Egypt's military defeat, Nasser emerged as a political victor. The nationalization of the Suez Canal was upheld, and Egypt retained control of the waterway. Nasser's defiance of Britain, France, and Israel galvanized Arab support, cementing his status as a leader of Pan-Arabism. The crisis also strengthened Egypt's ties with the Soviet Union, which provided increased military and economic aid. Britain and France. The Suez Crisis marked a significant blow to British and French prestige, signaling the decline of their imperial influence. The rapid withdrawal under U.S. pressure highlighted their diminished global power and strained their relations with the United States. The crisis accelerated decolonization as Britain and France faced growing challenges to their colonial holdings in Africa and Asia. Palestinian refugees. The Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip during the crisis temporarily disrupted Palestinian Fedayeen operations. But the withdrawal and UF deployment did not address the underlying refugee issue. The approximately 900,000 Palestinian refugees registered with UNRWA by 1956 remained stateless, with no progress on the right of return. The crisis further entrenched Palestinian grievances, as Gaza's brief occupation highlighted their vulnerability. Long-term consequences. Regional dynamics. The Suez Crisis deepened Arab-Israeli enmity, reinforcing the perception of Israel as a Western-aligned adversary. Nasser's strengthened position inspired Arab states to pursue more assertive anti-Israel policies, though internal rivalries limited coordinated action. The crisis also highlighted the fragility of the 1949 armistice lines, setting the stage for future conflicts, notably the 1967 Six-Day War. Cold War realignment. The crisis underscored the United States and Soviet Union's dominance in global politics. The U.S. emerged as the primary Western power in the Middle East, replacing Britain and France. the Soviet Union capitalized on the crisis to expand its influence, particularly in Egypt and Syria, through arms deals and economic aid. The Middle East became a key theater of Cold War competition, with Israel and Arab states aligning with opposing superpowers. Palestinian nationalism, the Suez Crisis, indirectly bolstered Palestinian nationalism. Nasser's support for the Palestinian cause, though largely rhetorical, inspired the formation of groups like Fatah in 1959, which would later lead the Palestinian resistance. The crisis highlighted the need for Palestinian self-organization, as reliance on Arab states proved insufficient. International institutions, the establishment of UNEF marked a milestone in UN peacekeeping, demonstrating the organization's potential to manage conflicts. However, the crisis exposed the limitations of international diplomacy. As the UN could not address the root causes of the Arab-Israeli conflict, including the Palestinian refugee issue and territorial disputes, regional tensions 1956-1957, the Suez Crisis exacerbated existing tensions in the Middle East, influencing Arab-Israeli relations, inter-Arab dynamics, and the broader geopolitical landscape, Arab-Israeli tensions. The crisis intensified Arab hostility toward Israel as the invasion reinforced perceptions of Israel as a tool of Western imperialism. Egypt's blockade of the Strait of Tiran was lifted, but cross-border raids resumed after Israel's withdrawal, albeit at a reduced scale due to UNF's presence. Israel's military success strengthened its deterrence posture, but also heightened Arab determination to counter its power. In Arab dynamics, Nasser's emergence as a regional hero strained relations among Arab states. Jordan and Saudi Arabia, aligned with the West, viewed Egypt's Soviet ties and radical rhetoric with suspicion. The formation of the United Arab Republic (UAR) in 1958, uniting Egypt and Syria, was partly inspired by Nasser's post-Suez prestige, but also exposed divisions. As other Arab states resisted Egyptian dominance, Palestinian responses, Palestinian refugees, particularly in Gaza, faced continued hardship. The brief Israeli occupation disrupted local governance, and the return of Egyptian control did not improve conditions. Fedayeen activity declined temporarily due to UNEF's presence, but the lack of progress on repatriation or statehood fueled frustration, laying the groundwork for future resistance movements, global powers, and the Middle East. The U.S. introduced the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, pledging support to Middle Eastern states facing communist threats, partly to counter Soviet gains post-Suez. This policy strengthened U.S. ties with Israel, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, but alienated Egypt and Syria. The Soviet Union deepened its influence, providing Egypt with military and economic support, including aid for the Aswan Dam. Perspectives on the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis is interpreted differently by various actors, reflecting their interests and experiences. Israeli perspective: Israel viewed the crisis as a strategic success, having achieved its goals of neutralizing Fedayeen threats and securing maritime access. The IDF's performance bolstered national confidence, and the crisis strengthened ties with France, a key arms supplier. However, Israel's reliance on Western support and the forced withdrawal highlighted its geopolitical constraints. Egyptian and Arab perspective: for Egypt and much of the Arab world, the crisis was a triumph of anti-colonial resistance. Nasser's survival and retention of the canal galvanized Pan-Arabism. Though military losses exposed Egypt's vulnerabilities, Arab states and Palestinians saw the crisis as evidence of Western aggression, reinforcing anti-Israel sentiment. Western perspective: Britain and France faced humiliation as the crisis marked the decline of their global influence. The U.S., while critical of the invasion, used the crisis to assert its leadership in the West, reshaping alliances in the Middle East. The crisis also strained NATO unity, as the U.S. prioritized its interests over those of its allies. Palestinian perspective: Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, experienced the crisis as a continuation of their marginalization. The brief Israeli occupation and subsequent return to Egyptian control did not address their demands for return or self-determination, deepening their reliance on Arab states and emerging resistance groups. Legacy and commemoration: the Suez Crisis left a lasting legacy in the Middle East. For Israel, it reinforced the importance of military strength in Western alliances, shaping its security policies. For Egypt, it elevated Nasser's status and solidified the canal's nationalization, a symbol of anti-colonial victory. The crisis also accelerated decolonization, as Britain and France's weakened positions emboldened independence movements. In the Arab world, the crisis inspired nationalist movements, but highlighted the limitations of Arab unity. For Palestinians, it underscored the need for self-reliance. Contributing to the rise of groups like the Palestine Liberation Organization PLO in 1964, internationally. The crisis established the UN's role in peacekeeping, but exposed its inability to resolve underlying conflicts. The Suez Crisis of 1956 to 1957 was a transformative event that reshaped the Middle East and global politics. Driven by Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, Israeli security concerns, and Anglo-French imperial ambitions. The crisis culminated in a tripartite invasion and a swift international response. While Israel achieved tactical gains, Egypt's political victory strengthened Nasser's leadership and Panarabism. The crisis marked the decline of British and French influence, elevated US and Soviet roles, and deepened Arab-Israeli tensions. Understanding the Suez Crisis and its regional repercussions provides critical insight into the evolving dynamics of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the broader geopolitical landscape of the 1950s. The road to the Six-Day War 1957 to 1967. The decade between 1957 and 1967 was a period of escalating tensions in the Middle East, culminating in the Six-Day War of June 1967, conflict that profoundly reshaped the Arab-Israeli conflict and regional dynamics. Following the Suez Crisis of 1956, Israel continued to consolidate its statehood, while Arab states, led by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, pursued strategies to counter Israel's growing strength. Palestinian resistance evolved, with the emergence of organized groups like Fatah, and Cold War rivalries intensified regional instability. This subsegment examines the key developments in Israel's state-building, Arab responses, Palestinian activism, and the international context that paved the way for the 1967 war. By analyzing these factors, this chapter provides a nuanced understanding of the complex path to one of the 20th century's most transformative conflicts. Israel's continued state-building, 1957 to 1967. Following the Suez Crisis, Israel focused on strengthening its political, economic, and military structures while addressing internal social challenges. The period saw significant achievements but also persistent vulnerabilities that shaped its approach to the growing regional tensions. Political stability and governance. Israel's parliamentary democracy, led by the Mapai Party under David Ben-Gurion until his resignation in 1963, remained stable despite coalition frictions. Levi Eshkol succeeded Ben-Gurion as prime minister, maintaining Mapai's dominance while navigating tensions between socialist, religious, and nationalist factions. The Knesset continued to pass legislation reinforcing Israel's Jewish character, such as amendments to the Law of Return, while addressing administrative needs. The Palestinian Arab minority, approximately 200,000 by 1967, remained under military administration until 1966. The lifting of this administration allowed greater freedom of movement, but discriminatory policies, including land expropriation and limited political representation, persisted. The Communist Party Maki and its splinter Raqqa faction gained traction among Palestinian citizens, advocating for equal rights and shaping their political identity. Economic growth and challenges. Israel's economy grew significantly, with an average annual GDP growth rate of 10% from 1957 to 1967. Agricultural production expanded through irrigation projects like the National Water Carrier, completed in 1964, which transported water from the Sea of Galilee to the Negev, boosting farming and settlement. Industrial output increased, with sectors like chemicals, electronics, and arms manufacturing gaining prominence. The Histadrut Labor Federation played a central role, controlling major enterprises and providing social services. Mass immigration continued, though at a slower pace than the early 1950s, with approximately 250,000 new immigrants arriving, primarily from North Africa and the Middle East. The government phased out Mubarak transit camps, replacing them with permanent housing, but socioeconomic disparities between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews persisted, fueling social tensions. Foreign aid, including U.S. economic assistance and German reparations, supported growth, though Israel faced periodic recessions. Notably in 1966, when unemployment rose to 7%. Social integration, social cohesion remained a challenge due to Israel's diverse population. The education system expanded, with compulsory schooling extended to age 16, emphasizing Hebrew and Zionist values to unify immigrants. Military service continued to serve as a melting pot for Jewish citizens, though exemptions for ultra-Orthodox Jews and exclusion of most Palestinian Arabs reinforced divisions. Palestinian citizens developed a distinct identity, balancing their status as Israeli citizens with their Palestinian heritage. Cultural expressions, such as poetry by Mahmoud Darwish and the newspaper Al-Ittihad, preserved Palestinian identity, while organizations like the Arab Students Committee advocated for civil rights. However, systemic inequalities, including limited access to land and jobs, fueled resentment. Military development and security. The Israel Defense Forces (IDF) underwent significant modernization, supported by arms acquisitions from France, which became Israel's primary supplier of tanks, aircraft, and missiles. By 1967, the IDF had 250,000 active and reserve personnel, with a focus on rapid mobilization and preemptive capabilities. The doctrine of deterrence, emphasizing swift and decisive responses to threats, was refined in response to ongoing cross-border incidents. Security challenges persisted, particularly along the Syrian and Jordanian borders. Syrian shelling from the Golan Heights targeted Israeli settlements in the Galilee, while Palestinian Fedayeen raids, though reduced after the Suez Crisis due to the United Nations Emergency Force, UNIF and Sinai, continued from Jordan and Syria. Israel's reprisal raids, such as the 1966 Samo operation in Jordan, which killed 18 Jordanian soldiers and civilians, escalated tensions and drew international criticism. Arab responses and regional dynamics. Arab states, led by Egypt, pursued strategies to counter Israel's consolidation, driven by the legacy of the 1948 Nakba and the Suez Crisis. The period saw a mix of diplomatic, military, and ideological efforts, complicated by inter-Arab rivalries and Cold War influences. Egyptian leadership in Pan-Arabism. Gamal Abdel Nasser's Egypt emerged as the leading Arab power. Bolstered by the political victory of the Suez Crisis, Nasser's Pan-Arabist ideology, advocating unity and resistance to Western influence, resonated across the region. The formation of the United Arab Republic (UAR) in 1958, uniting Egypt and Syria, was a high point of Pan-Arabism, though it collapsed in 1961 due to Syrian discontent with Egyptian dominance. Egypt modernized its military with Soviet support, acquiring advanced weaponry through the 1955 Czech arms deal and subsequent agreements. By 1967, Egypt's armed forces numbered over 200,000, with hundreds of tanks and aircraft. Nasser's support for Palestinian Fedayeen, particularly in Gaza, and his rhetoric against Israel strengthened his regional influence but heightened tensions. Jordan and the West Bank. Jordan, under King Hussein, controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, home to over 700,000 Palestinians, including many refugees. Jordan's pro-Western alignment, supported by British and U.S. aid, contrasted with Egypt's Soviet ties, creating tensions within the Arab world. The Arab Legion, Jordan's military, was well-trained but smaller than Egypt's. Focusing on maintaining control over the West Bank, Fedayeen raids from Jordan, often organized by Palestinian groups, provoked Israeli reprisals, straining Jordan-Israel relations. The 1966 Samu raid, targeting a West Bank village, sparked Palestinian protests against Jordan's government, highlighting the delicate balance King Hussein maintained between Palestinian aspirations and national stability. Syria and the Ba'ath Party. Syria, under a series of unstable governments, became increasingly radicalized after the 1963 Ba'ath Party coup. The Baathists, advocating socialist and Pan-Arabist policies, supported Palestinian resistance and escalated tensions with Israel over the Golan Heights. Disputes over the Jordan River's headwaters, particularly Israel's national water carrier, led to Syrian shelling of Israeli settlements and attempts to divert the river, prompting Israeli airstrikes. Syria's alignment with the Soviet Union and its sponsorship of Palestinian groups like Fatah, founded in 1959, intensified regional instability. By 1967, Syria's military had grown to 70,000 troops, though it remained less coordinated than Egypt's. Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian refugee population, numbering over 1 million by 1967, remained stateless, with most living in camps in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, provided essential services. But conditions remained dire, fueling demands for the right of return, as per UN. Resolution 194, the absence of a unified Palestinian leadership persisted, with the Arab Higher Committee weakened by exile and internal divisions. The formation of Fatah in 1959, led by Yasser Arafat, marked a shift toward organized Palestinian resistance. Fatah advocated armed struggle to liberate Palestine, conducting guerrilla raids from Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. The Palestine Liberation Organization PLO, established in 1964 under Ahmed Shukari and backed by the Arab League, aimed to represent Palestinian aspirations, but was initially controlled by Arab states, particularly Egypt. These groups laid the groundwork for a distinct Palestinian national movement, though their actions provoked Israeli reprisals, escalating tensions. Key developments leading to the Six-Day War. The road to the Six-Day War was marked by a series of events that heightened tensions and created a volatile environment. The following sections outline the critical developments. Water disputes and border clashes. The Jordan River's headwaters became a flashpoint in the early 1960s. Israel's national water carrier, diverting water from the Sea of Galilee, reduced flows to Jordan and Syria, prompting Arab League plans to divert the river's tributaries. Syria began construction on diversion projects in 1965, leading to Israeli airstrikes and artillery exchanges. These clashes, particularly along the Syrian-Israeli armistice line, killed dozens and heightened mutual distrust. Border incidents increased, with over 1,000 clashes reported between 1965 and 1967. Syrian shelling from the Golan Heights and Palestinian raids, often supported by Syria, provoked Israeli responses, including the November 1966 Samu raid in Jordan, which destabilized the region and strained Jordan's relations with both Palestinians and Israel. Egyptian-Israeli tensions. The presence of UNEFT in Sinai and Gaza, established after the Suez Crisis, reduced Fedi-in raids but did not eliminate tensions. Egypt's blockade of the Strait of Tiran, intermittently in force since 1948, continued to restrict Israel's maritime access. Nasser's military buildup, supported by Soviet arms, heightened Israeli fears of an imminent threat. By 1967, Egypt had over 1,000 tanks and 400 aircraft, outnumbering Israel's forces. In May 1967, a series of escalatory moves set the stage for war. On May 14th, Egypt mobilized troops in Sinai, citing intelligence later disputed of an Israeli attack on Syria. On May 16th, Nasser requested the withdrawal of UNEF, which the UN complied with, removing the buffer between Egypt and Israel. On May 22nd, Egypt reimposed the blockade of the Strait of Tiran, a move Israel considered an act of war. Combined with Nasser's fiery rhetoric, created a sense of existential threat in Israel. Arab alliances and rhetoric. The formation of defense pacts among Arab states amplified tensions. In November 1966, Egypt and Syria signed a mutual defense agreement, committing to support each other against Israel. Jordan, initially wary of Nasser, joined a tripartite alliance with Egypt and Syria in May 1967, placing its forces under Egyptian command. Public statements by Arab leaders, particularly Nasser, calling for Israel's destruction, were broadcast across the region, heightening Israeli fears of a coordinated attack. Israel's leadership under Prime Minister Levi Eshkol faced intense domestic pressure to respond to the escalating threats. The IDF, led by Chief of Staff Yitzhak Rabin, advocated a preemptive strike, arguing that Egypt's mobilization and the Tiran blockade posed an imminent danger. On June 4, 1967, Israel's cabinet approved military action, culminating in the launch of Operation Focus on June 5th, a surprise airstrike that destroyed much of Egypt's air force, marking the start of the Six-Day War. International context in the Cold War. The Cold War played a significant role in the road to 1967. The United States, Israel's primary ally by the mid-1960s, provided economic aid and diplomatic support, but was cautious about direct military involvement due to its focus on Vietnam. The Soviet Union, backing Egypt and Syria, supplied arms and advisors, escalating the arms race. Soviet misinformation in May 1967, alleging Israeli troop concentrations on the Syrian border, contributed to Egypt's mobilization, though both superpowers sought to avoid direct confrontation. The United Nations proved ineffective in diffusing the crisis. The withdrawal of UNEF, at Egypt's request, removed a critical stabilizing force. And UN-Security Council debates were paralyzed by Cold War divisions. Western Europe, particularly France, shifted away from Israel after 1967. With President Charles de Gaulle imposing an arms embargo, reflecting changing global alignments, consequences and legacy. Immediate consequences. The Six-Day War, fought from June 5 to June 10, 1967, was a decisive Israeli victory. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria, tripling its territorial control. The war resulted in approximately 20,000 Arab and 800 Israeli casualties. With significant destruction in Arab territories, the war created a new wave of Palestinian refugees, with over 300,000 fleeing the West Bank and Gaza, many becoming refugees for the second time. Israel's occupation of these territories introduced new challenges, including the administration of over 1 million Palestinians and the question of their political status. Long-term consequences. Israel. The war transformed Israel into a regional power, but the occupation of new territories created complex challenges. Settlement construction began in the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan Heights, driven by security and ideological motives, complicating future peace prospects. The war also strengthened Israel's ties with the U.S., which became its primary arms supplier, replacing France. Palestinian nationalism. The Arab defeat discredited state-led efforts to liberate Palestine, accelerating the rise of Palestinian nationalism. PLO. Under Fatah's influence by 1969, adopted arms struggle as its primary strategy, gaining international recognition. The war also entrenched the Palestinian refugee crisis, with no progress on the right of return. Arab states. The war was a humiliating defeat for Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, weakening Nasser's Pan-Arabist project. Egypt and Syria pursued diplomatic efforts to regain lost territories, culminating in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Jordan's loss of the West Bank shifted its focus to internal stability, while Syria's radicalism intensified. Regional and global impact. The war reshaped Middle Eastern geopolitics, solidifying the U.S.-Israel alliance and Soviet support for Arab states. The occupation of Palestinian territories became a central issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict, fueling resistance and international debates. UN Security Council Resolution 242, passed in November 1967, called for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and a just resolution for refugees. But its ambiguous language hindered implementation. Perspectives on the road to 1967. Israeli perspective. Israel viewed the war as a necessary preemptive strike to avert an existential threat. The rapid victory bolstered national confidence and the IDF's reputation. But the occupation of new territories sparked debates over security versus peace prospects. Israeli historians like Benny Morris emphasize the strategic imperatives, while critics highlight the escalation caused by reprisal raids. Arab perspective. Arab states, particularly Egypt and Syria, framed the war as a result of Israeli aggression and Western support. The defeat exposed military and political weaknesses, undermining Pan-Arabism. Nasser's miscalculations, particularly the Tehran blockade, were later acknowledged. But public rhetoric focused on Israel's expansionism. Palestinian perspective. Palestinians saw the war as a continuation of their dispossession. Following the Nakba, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza galvanized resistance, with groups like Fatah gaining prominence. The war underscored the need for Palestinian self-reliance as Arab state support proved inadequate. International perspective: the US and Soviet Union sought to manage the crisis to avoid direct confrontation, but their support for opposing sides fueled the arms race. The UN's failure to prevent the war highlighted its limitations, though Resolution 242 shaped subsequent peace efforts. Legacy and commemoration: the Six-Day War remains a defining moment in the Arab-Israeli conflict. For Israel, it is celebrated as a military triumph, but also marks the beginning of a complex occupation. For Palestinians, it is remembered as the Nakba setback, reinforcing their struggle for self-determination. Annual commemorations, such as Jerusalem Day in Israel and protests in Palestinian communities, reflect the war's enduring impact. The war's legacy includes the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the rise of settlement movements, and the internationalization of the Palestinian cause. It also set the stage for peace efforts, such as the Camp David Accords. While entrenching divisions that continue to challenge resolution, the road to the Six-Day War was shaped by a decade of escalating tensions. Driven by Israel's state-building, Arab responses, Palestinian resistance, and Cold War dynamics. Water disputes, border clashes, and Nasser's assertive policies created a volatile environment. Culminating in Israel's preemptive strike in June 1967, the war's outcomes: Israeli territorial expansion, Palestinian displacement, and Arab defeatry shaped the Middle East, entrenching the Arab-Israeli conflict. Understanding this period provides critical insight into the complexities of the conflict and its lasting repercussions.
Chapter 5 closes on a transformative era, from the Nakba and Israel's state building to the Suez Crisis and rising tensions before the Six-Day War. Borders, resources, and identities were reshaped, deepening the Arab-Israeli conflict. Join me for Chapter 6, where we'll explore the aftermath of the Six-Day War, shifting borders, and how these events shaped the region's future. Subscribe, hit the like button, share your thoughts, and see you in the next video with the deep chapter.